For a long time, I could not understand why life seemed to resist me, especially when I believed I was doing everything right. I was kind. I was considerate. I gave my time freely. I tried to be fair and generous in all things. And yet the very things I desired seemed to move away from me, as though an unseen hand were quietly closing a door. I remember asking myself in private moments, not aloud, what more must I do to deserve it? There was no anger in that question, only confusion, and beneath it a subtle ache, the feeling that life was withholding something because I had not yet proven myself worthy to receive it. At the time, I believed this struggle was noble. I told myself that patience was virtue, that sacrifice was spiritual, that if I continued to give without asking, life would one day respond in kind. And so I gave more. I softened my wants. I dismissed my own longing as selfish. I learned to feel uneasy when something was offered to me as though receiving were an imposition, a breach of character. Yet the more carefully I behaved, the more distant fulfillment appeared, and I could not reconcile this with what I believed about a just and orderly world. It was not that I felt unlucky. What troubled me far more was the quiet suspicion that life was not opposing me at all, but simply reflecting something within me that I could not yet see. I noticed that when opportunity approached, I hesitated. When abundance knocked, I questioned it. When love or ease appeared, I wondered whether I had earned it. And in that moment of hesitation, something subtle withdrew, not violently, not dramatically, but gently, as though respecting my unspoken refusal. This was the most unsettling realization of all, that life was not denying me because I had done wrong, but because I was not yet willing to accept. I had learned how to give, but I had not learned how to receive. I had trained myself to feel virtuous in effort, but uncomfortable in having. And so life, faithful to the law by which it operates, could only echo that state back to me again and again until I was ready to look honestly at the consciousness from which I was living. Only later did I begin to see the misunderstanding that quietly shaped my entire approach to life. I had been taught directly and indirectly that receiving was a reward, something granted after effort, after proof, after endurance. And so, without ever saying it aloud, I assumed that wanting was acceptable, but having was premature. I could desire, but I must not yet possess. I could hope, but I must not yet accept. That single assumption governed everything. In that state, striving felt natural. Effort seemed noble. Waiting appeared virtuous. I mistook tension for faith and endurance for belief. I believed that if I held on long enough, if I behaved correctly, if I remained patient without complaint, life would eventually soften and allow me what I wanted. But all the while, I was unknowingly affirming something far more powerful than any spoken word. I was affirming that fulfillment was not yet mine. This is the subtle trap. Not effort itself, but the state from which effort is born. When you strive from the assumption that you must earn what you desire, you are declaring, without words, that you do not already possess it in consciousness. And consciousness, being the only reality, can only mirror that declaration. It cannot give you what you are unwilling to accept as already true. I began to notice how often I postponed my own good. When something came easily, I distrusted it. When relief appeared, I questioned it. I would tell myself, this feels too simple, or perhaps I should wait a little longer, as though ease itself required justification. And in doing so, I unknowingly rejected the very state I claimed to desire. I wanted peace, yet I remained vigilant. I wanted abundance, yet I stayed cautious. What I had not yet understood was this: receiving is not an action, it is a state. And a state cannot be entered gradually through effort. It is assumed in an instant. You either occupy it or you do not. There is no waiting period in consciousness. There is only acceptance or refusal. The law is exact and unemotional. It does not reward effort, patience, or goodness. It reflects only the state from which you live. And as long as I remained in the state of one who was trying to become worthy, I could not experience the life of one who already was. This was not a failure of technique. It was a misunderstanding of identity. I was attempting to receive from effort rather than from assumption. And until that confusion was resolved, no amount of patience, goodness, or striving could alter the reflection I continued to meet in the world. It was only when I ceased trying to correct my circumstances that something far more revealing came into view. I saw that my difficulty was not rooted in action at all, but in position. I had been standing in the state of one who waits, one who prepares, one who hopes, and from that position, I was asking life to deliver the experience of one who already has. The contradiction was subtle, yet absolute, for I began to notice this simple truth. Whatever I claimed to desire, I was always looking toward it. I was facing peace, facing security, facing abundance as something ahead of me rather than something within me. And in doing so, I unknowingly affirmed the identity of one who does not yet possess. This was not doubt in the emotional sense. It was doubt as position. I saw then that consciousness was not something I used, but the place from which I lived. It was not a thought I entertained, but a standpoint I occupied. And from that standpoint, every desire appeared as something separate, something to be reached rather than assumed. This distinction altered everything, for I realized that imagining from desire is not the same as imagining from possession. One observes, the other inhabits. One looks toward a state, the other lives from it. And the law responds only to the place from which one lives. In that moment, the words "I am" ceased to be a phrase and became a mirror. I saw that whatever followed those words in feeling, not in speech, not in repetition, but in feeling, described the state I was occupying. I was not quietly assuming I am fulfilled. I was assuming, without words, I am becoming fulfilled. And that single distinction explained the entire delay. To be becoming is to be waiting. And waiting, no matter how patient or sincere, is still an assumption of absence. I saw then that life had not been withholding anything from me. It had been answering me with perfect fidelity. It had simply reflected the place from which I was living, not the outcome I was hoping one day to reach. It was not until I understood this change of position that events began to rearrange themselves without effort. I did not strain for signs, nor did I watch circumstances for proof. I simply ceased negotiating with life. I no longer approached desire as something to be justified, delayed, or earned. And in that quiet shift, receiving ceased to feel dangerous. At that time, an opportunity presented itself that would have once stirred great inner conflict. There was travel involved, arrangements to be made, and with them, the familiar temptation to accept less than what I inwardly desired, less than what felt natural to me. Previously, I would have reasoned with myself. I would have explained why compromise was sensible, why modesty was proper, why taking the lesser place was safer, and more respectable. But something in me had changed. I did not argue. I did not persuade myself. I did not rehearse affirmations or plead for outcomes. I simply occupied the feeling of being already received well. Not entitled, not demanding, but quietly at ease with the idea that what matched my state would meet me without resistance. There was no excitement in this assumption. There was relief. In the past, I would have felt guilty for wanting the better position, as though ease must always be paid for in advance with discomfort. But now, there was no inner argument to settle. I did not feel I was taking something. I felt I was allowing what already belonged to the state I was living from. And so, without effort, without appeal, circumstances shifted. What had appeared unavailable suddenly became available. What had been presented as the limitation quietly dissolved. I was not surprised by this, nor was I grateful in the emotional sense. I felt only recognition, the calm acknowledgement that life had simply caught up with where I already stood. This was the most important discovery of all, that receiving does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives naturally when resistance ends. The moment I no longer felt the need to justify my place, life no longer required explanation. The moment I stopped proving worth no longer needed proof. I saw then that what had changed was not the world, but my relationship to it. I was no longer asking permission to have. I was no longer bracing myself for disappointment. I was simply present in the feeling of being already included. And from that inclusion, events unfolded with an ease that no effort could ever have produced. This was not a miracle. It was alignment, not a reward for goodness, but the natural consequence of occupying the state from which receiving is possible. And once I saw this, I understood that every delay I had known before was not imposed from without, but maintained from within. When receiving became natural, life no longer needed to persuade me. It responded simply and faithfully to the place I had finally learned to stand. After this understanding settled within me, there was nothing left to do. That was perhaps the most unfamiliar sensation of all. For so long I had lived with an inner posture of readiness, as though something were always about to be required of me. A thought to correct, a feeling to adjust, a moment to manage, and suddenly that posture released. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel enlightened. I felt relieved of the need to earn, to justify, to monitor myself for signs of worthiness, relieved of the quiet tension that had accompanied even my most sincere efforts. In its place, there was a stillness, not dramatic, not emotional, but unmistakably present. In that stillness, I saw clearly what had been exhausting me. It was not desire, it was resistance to having. I had been faithful to waiting, faithful to effort, faithful to becoming, but not faithful to being. And being, I discovered, requires no strain. It requires only acceptance. From that acceptance arose a simple knowing that life is not persuaded by goodness nor moved by endurance. It reflects with absolute precision the state from which one lives. And when that state is settled, when it no longer wavers between wanting and allowing, life has nothing left to negotiate. This is what it means to enter the Sabbath, not rest from activity, but rest from inner argument, not the cessation of desire, but the end of striving. When the state is assumed, the work is finished. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. I did not stop imagining. I stopped imagining from lack. I did not abandon desire. I abandoned the posture of reaching. And in doing so, I found myself quietly inhabiting the very state I had once believed lay somewhere ahead of me. There is great mercy in this law. It does not ask you to be better. It asks you only to be honest about where you are standing. And when that honesty reveals that you are already willing to receive, life responds without delay, without drama, without resistance. So now, there is nothing to force, nothing to correct, nothing to pursue. This state is entered. The assumption is complete. And having seen this, the most natural response is not action, but silence. Now, let us go into the silence